"I just want to see my balance," said the 90-year-old black man. The millionaire laughed until he saw the screen. "I just want to see my balance." Those 5 words came out of the 90-year-old man's mouth with such calmness that they seemed dangerous. The bank was crowded that Thursday morning in Hartford, Connecticut. Lines at the teller windows, managers circulating with briefcases, the constant sound of keyboards, and the faint scent of new air conditioning. And in the midst of it all, Arthur Williams walked through the glass door wearing worn-out slacks, a shoe that had seen better decades, and a navy blue coat that had likely been bought back when men still wore hats without ceremony. No one looked at him. Or rather, they did. The way you look at something that shouldn't be there. He walked slowly toward the standard service line. Each step was measured, not out of limitation, but out of habit. Arthur Williams was 90 years old and had learned, long ago, great cost. That haste is for those who don't yet know where they're going. But before he reached the end of the line, a voice cut through the air. "Hey." Arthur stopped. "Hey, you. The priority line is over there. This one's for customers." Conrad Cooper was leaning against the premium service counter as if the place had been built for him. Open collar, a watch on his wrist worth more than most of the cars parked outside. Gray hair that cost $300 per cut. 52 years old. Owner of a chain of logistics warehouses in the northeast of the country, with the kind of smile that only appears on faces that rarely hear the word no. He looked at Arthur with the expression of someone who had just seen a fly land on his dessert. "This bank has standards," Conrad said, loud enough for 4 or 5 people nearby to hear without having to turn their heads. "Do you understand, Uncle?" An employee named Emily Clark, 28 years old. She'd started at that branch less than 6 months ago. Stopped typing. Not on instruction. Out of instinct. The branch manager, Dennis Myers, took a step toward the counter, not to defend Arthur, to contain the awkwardness before it spread too far. It was the kind of move bank managers learn early on. Never take sides. Always smooth things over. Arthur didn't back down. He didn't quicken his pace, didn't lower his gaze, didn't change his expression. He simply turned his face toward Conrad with a calmness that somehow was more disconcerting than any response could be. "I just want to see my balance," he repeated. Same voice, same cadence, as if Conrad's interruption hadn't happened. Conrad let out a short, nasal laugh, the kind that doesn't need an audience but prefers to have one. Dennis gave a crooked smile, and Emily Clark watched Arthur for a second longer than anyone else in that room. Not out of pity. Out of something she still couldn't name. There was an envelope on the old man's lap, sealed, yellowed at the edges, looking like something that had been stored away for many years before being brought out on that specific morning. Arthur held it with both hands, resting on top of it, as if it were fragile, or as if it were too heavy to let fall. He took a ticket from the machine, walked to the nearest waiting chair and crossed his fingers over the envelope. And waited. Conrad Cooper had gone back to talking to Dennis about the loan he wanted to approve that very morning. An expansion project. Big numbers, short term. His voice filled the branch the way the voice of someone accustomed to being the only one speaking always does. And Arthur waited with the envelope on his lap and his eyes half closed, like someone who had been in rooms like this many times before and survived them all. What no one there knew. Not Dennis, not Conrad, not the people who occasionally glanced at the old man in plain clothes in the waiting chair, was the reason Arthur Williams had chosen to come to this bank, to this specific branch, on this specific morning. That answer would come, but not yet. If you're enjoying this story, subscribe to the channel. There's much more to come. The first time Arthur Williams walked into a bank, he was 36 years old. It was 1970. Hartford still bore the marks of a city that wasn't quite sure what it wanted to be. The northern neighborhood was black. Downtown was white. And the bank downtown didn't need a sign on the door to make it clear who was expected there. Arthur had walked in with a loan application to buy a piece of land. He'd been working for 14 years in the warehouse of a textile factory. Never missed a day. Saved every penny he didn't have to spend on rent and food. The envelope he brought that afternoon contained receipts, statements, and proof of income. Everything organized. Everything in order. The manager greeted him, standing up. He didn't invite him to sit down. He looked at the documents for less than 2 minutes, handed them back, and said, without looking up, "It's not possible at the moment." No explanation, no alternative. Without even pretending he'd analyzed them carefully, Arthur left without saying a word. It had been 3 years of similar attempts. Different banks, different managers, the same answer dressed in different clothes. Sometimes they were direct words. Sometimes they were just expressions. That way of looking at a black man in work clothes as if he were a problem to be dismissed before he caused a disturbance. He never stopped trying. That stubbornness wasn't naivety. It was calculation. Arthur understood with a precision that outsiders rarely grasp that the only possible response to a system that says no is to keep showing up until the cost of refusal becomes too high to sustain. In 1974, he bought the land. In cash, with money no bank had touched. That same year, he met Dorothy, a woman who laughed with her whole body and who took 3 months to agree to go out with him because, as she herself said later, men who don't give up easily don't let go easily either. It was the best compliment anyone had ever paid her. They built it together. Literally, Arthur learned masonry on the weekends because hiring labor cost more than he could afford. Dorothy painted every room in the house a different color and said it was so the house would know it belonged to them. The years that followed were years of accumulated silence, not the silence of those who give up, the silence of those who work. Arthur invested carefully and with a patience that borders on the incomprehensible for anyone who has never had to build from scratch. Land in the countryside that no one wanted in the 1970s, shares in small companies that grew, lease agreements renewed every 5 years with adjusted values, decades of decisions that seemed insignificant at the time they were made, and that together became something that no longer fit in a drawer. Dorothy died in 2019. She never knew the exact extent of what they had built. Arthur never felt it necessary to tell her. For her, enough was always enough, and there was a dignity in that which he never wanted to disturb. But there was one thing Arthur had kept since 1987. One thing Dorothy never saw. An envelope. It had arrived in the mail one October afternoon, without warning. Arthur had read it once, tucked it into the bottom drawer of the dresser, and never opened it again. Not because he had forgotten, but because he understood that afternoon that there was a right time to do what needed to be done with it. And that time had not yet come. For 36 years, he woke up on some mornings knowing that the envelope was there, waiting along with him. That Thursday, when he left the house in his blue coat and old shoes, he knew the moment had arrived. Emily Clark had spent her first few months at that agency trying to understand the rhythm of the place, not the rhythm of the processes. She'd learned that quickly. The rhythm of the people. Who served whom and at what pace. Who smiled differently depending on the customer in front of them. Which questions were never asked aloud, but were always present in the air. She had grown up in a family that didn't have a bank account until she was 14. She knew how to recognize the texture of that silence. When Arthur's number was called, she was the one who greeted him. "Good morning, sir," Emily said. "How can I help you?" "I just want to check my balance," he replied. It was the third time he'd said that morning, with the same precision as the previous times. She smiled, the real smile, not the polite one, and asked for his ID. Arthur handed it over without haste. Emily took it, turned to the keyboard, and began typing the number, and stopped. She looked at the screen. She looked again. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a second that seemed to last longer than it should. She took a deep breath, the kind of breath people take when they're processing something their brain refuses to accept on the first try, and turned her face toward Arthur. "Could you give me a moment?" Arthur nodded as if he'd already expected that reaction, as if he knew precisely what that pause meant. Across the office, Dennis Myers had been with Conrad Cooper for 40 minutes. The loan Conrad wanted was $14 million, an expansion into a new logistics corridor in Springfield, 3 warehouses, complete infrastructure, an 18-month timeline. The deal looked solid on paper. Conrad had collateral, a payment history, and documented cash flow. But there was one detail Dennis had been putting off mentioning. The project needed an external guarantee, an anchor guarantor, an account holder whose balance at that institution would serve as secondary collateral for a transaction of that magnitude. It was a requirement implemented after a series of corporate defaults the bank had faced the previous year. There was no room for negotiation with the credit committee on this. Dennis had identified a name on the list of account holders eligible for that role at that branch. He had tried calling 3 times the previous week. No answer. And now, as Conrad Cooper was describing timelines, that name had walked through the door wearing a blue coat and a pair of shoes that had seen decades of work. Conrad was talking about the second warehouse when Dennis saw Emily rise from her chair and walk toward him with an expression he couldn't immediately place. It wasn't urgency. It wasn't alarm. It was the look of someone who had discovered something and was still figuring out how to break the news. "Dennis," she came close enough that Conrad couldn't hear. "You need to see this before you finish this conversation." Conrad looked at her with obvious impatience. "You're interrupting a meeting." Emily didn't respond to Conrad. She kept her eyes on Dennis. And Dennis, who in 20 years of banking had learned to read his employees' faces before any report, excused himself from Conrad and followed Emily to her terminal. He looked at the screen. He stood still. The number on the screen wasn't a mistake. Dennis knew this because the system doesn't display a balance of that magnitude in an individual account without multiple automatic verifications. He knew because he had worked at that branch for 17 years and had never seen that amount in a personal account. He knew above all because Arthur Williams was sitting in Emily's customer service chair with the look of someone awaiting the results of a test whose outcome he already knew. "Mr. Williams," Dennis said, and the involuntary formality in his own voice surprised him. "How long have you been an account holder at this branch?" "Since 1991, Arthur replied. "I opened the account with the manager who was here before. Carey, if I'm not mistaken." "A fair man." Dennis nodded slowly. 33 years. An account that had grown quietly for more than 3 decades, fed by regular transfers that no one had ever connected to a face, a presence, a name spoken aloud inside that branch. Because Arthur Williams never came in person. Everything was managed by advisors, by power of attorney through remote channels. Until that morning. "Would you like to be seen in a private room?" Dennis offered. "I don't need a private room," Arthur said. "I just wanted to confirm the balance. You've already confirmed it. You may continue." Emily discreetly turned the monitor toward Arthur. He looked at the screen with the same expression one uses when glancing at a watch, checking information one already knows, just to make sure the world is in the right place. He nodded once, slightly. "That's correct." On the other side of the branch, Conrad Cooper had stopped talking about the schedule. There was something different in the air, a shift in gravity that certain men recognized not through reason, but through the instinct developed by those accustomed to being the center and who sense when that center shifts. He looked at Dennis, at Emily, at the old man in the waiting chair, and the first shadow of something, not quite doubt, still just the premonition of doubt, flew across his face. Dennis walked back to Conrad with his notepad and an expression that had shifted in tone. Not dramatically, just enough for anyone paying attention to realize the conversation had taken a different turn. "Mr. Cooper, we need to talk about the guarantee for your transaction." "I brought all the collateral," Conrad said. "We've already discussed that." "The collateral is in order. What I'm referring to now is the anchor guarantor required by the credit committee for transactions over $10 million. It's a requirement implemented last year, with no exceptions. The name listed as an eligible account holder for this role at this branch." Dennis paused for a second, not for dramatic effect, but because the following words carried a weight he was weighing. "Is Arthur Williams." The silence that settled in was not noisy. It was the kind of silence that occupies physical space. Conrad slowly turned toward the waiting chair. Arthur was looking at him, not with satisfaction, not with anger, with 90 years of patience that no expression can feign. "You," Conrad said. The word came out differently from all the others he had spoken that morning. Arthur did not reply. Dennis continued, "Without Arthur Williams's endorsement, or that of another anchor account holder of equivalent volume, who did not exist at that branch, the $14 million loan could not be approved that day. The requirement came from the Central Committee, beyond the reach of any local decision. Conrad Cooper needed the man he had sent to the priority line, the man in the blue coat and old shoes with the yellowed envelope still resting on his lap, untouched, sealed, waiting for the moment Arthur had known for a long time would come. There was a moment, brief, almost imperceptible, when Conrad Cooper considered pretending that this wasn't happening. It was an old reflex, the kind of reaction that decades of money instill in a person's instincts. When reality contradicts the narrative, rewrite the narrative. But the bank system was not rewritable. The credit committee did not negotiate with personal history, and Arthur Williams remained seated in the same chair, with the same posture, with the same intact envelope on his lap. Dennis approached Arthur with the professional tact of someone who understands he is mediating something that goes beyond a banking transaction. "Mr. Williams, would you be available to discuss the possibility of—" "I know what you're going to ask," Arthur said. "And the answer is, it depends." Conrad took a deep breath. It was the kind of breath that takes effort. He walked to the service area, stopped 2 meters from Arthur, and stood there for a second. That second when a man who has never had to ask for anything is figuring out how this works. "Mr. Williams," the formality sounded strange coming from him. "I expressed myself inappropriately earlier. It wasn't my intention." "It was," Arthur said, without aggression, as if correcting a factual statement. "It was exactly your intention. You wanted me to feel out of place. It worked for about 2 minutes. Conrad didn't respond. But that's not what I'm evaluating right now," Arthur continued. "Business is business. My advisors sent me the Springfield project prospectus last week. The numbers are solid. The location makes sense." Emily Clark, who had been standing at the terminal pretending to organize documents, looked up. Conrad opened his mouth. "You've reviewed?" "When I learned you were looking for an anchor investor in this agency," Arthur said with the matter-of-factness of someone describing the weather outside, "I decided to come in person." The weight of those words settled slowly over the room. He had planned it, not as a trap, as a deliberate choice. He could have sent a representative. He could have provided the guarantee by proxy, over the phone, through any channel that preserved distance. Instead, he had put on the blue coat, slipped into the old shoes, and walked through the same door Conrad had used, as if the two came from worlds that should never touch, because there was something that needed to be done. In person, Arthur looked down at the envelope in his lap. He was silent for a moment, the kind of silence that makes no apology and needs no filling. Then, with slow, careful movements, he slid his finger under the flap of the envelope and opened it for the first time in 36 years. It was a letter, handwritten. 4 pages, the ink slightly faded, the uneven handwriting of someone who had written with physical or emotional effort. Probably both. Arthur didn't read it aloud. He kept his eyes on the pages for nearly a full minute, in absolute silence. Emily saw his jaw tighten once. Just once. Then, Arthur folded the pages with the same care with which he had opened them, put them back in the envelope, and looked up at Conrad. "This was written by a man who humiliated me far worse than you did this morning," he said. "In 1987, in an office hallway, in front of 16 people. He died 3 years later and sent this letter before that." Conrad stood motionless. He asked for forgiveness. "I never replied because I didn't know what to say." Arthur looked at the envelope one last time, holding it as if returning something he had carried too far. "For 36 years, I didn't know. Today I know." He tucked the envelope into the inside pocket of his coat. "You're going to ask me in person," he said to Conrad. No threat in his voice, no triumph, just the firmness of someone who simply knows the value of what he's asking for. "Not the bank. Me. Looking me in the eye." The silence that followed lasted long enough for Dennis Myers to realize he should stay quiet, for Emily Clark to feel something tighten in her throat without being able to name it exactly, for Conrad Cooper, 52 years old, warehouse owner, VIP client, man with an expensive watch, to understand, perhaps for the first time in his adult life, what it means to be on the receiving end of humiliation and to have to decide what to do about it. Conrad asked, not with the right words, not eloquently, with the clumsy, inadequate words of someone learning a language they've never studied. But he asked, standing there, looking into Arthur Williams's eyes. And Arthur, with 90 years of history that no bank statement can accurately convey, looked at that man for a long moment. Then he said, "All right." Not because he had forgotten, not because the closed doors, the years of silence, the morning of that morning had ceased to weigh on him, but because carrying that burden had a cost that he had already decided, long before Conrad could have imagined, did not need to be paid forever. The guarantee was signed that afternoon. Arthur walked away along the same path he had come, with the empty envelope in the pocket of his blue coat and his old shoes tapping on the asphalt of Hartford. Emily Clark watched out the window until he turned the corner, and she thought that there were things no balance, no matter how large, no matter how it wouldn't fit on the screen, could express with precision. If this story resonated with you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Every story here is built to last.